might kick off now and just slowly ease into this.
Yep.
It's 7:01, and typically over the next 5 or 10 minutes, we'll have another 20 or 30 people sign in. So what we'll do is we just get this session underway slowly. Welcome everyone to what's now the 4th Kieser on the Couch session. And for the first time, we're live streaming this on Facebook and on Instagram. So thank you, Carlo, for being all over the tech. And before we welcome Andrew a little bit later, I just take an early opportunity to say thanks to Andrew McDonald for giving up his time. I know he's got a couple of young kids at home, and he locked them out of his office for the night, and he's sitting down, wants to learn a little bit more about the lumbar spine. And then by about 7:30, we should be able to take his mic off mute and ask him a few questions about how the Australian cricket team is going and whether the IPL is going to relaunch again this year. So at 7:02, we've got a tradition in the Kieser on the Couch sessions that we launch a poll. And the poll is just a bit of interest for us about who's tuning in tonight and also why you're tuning in as well. So I'm just going to pop a poll up on the screen for everybody. And if you could just take a quick couple of seconds to answer the 3 questions in front of you. So the first question, have you suffered lower back pain? Number 2, what's the sport you participate in most frequently? What are you going to answer to that one, Drew? Are you a running man, tennis man, golf, cricket?
I'd say all of the above, Jim. Well, actually, no, that's a lie. I'm going to say rugby, absolutely not. I'm not tough enough for that. But everything else is definitely a goer.
Well, you can only pick one, mate. So
right,
which one are you committing to?
I'd like to pick cricket, but I'm going to go for golf.
Well, we were just covered that subject, mate. That wouldn't be true in Victoria at the moment.
No, true. So my own back and my own golfing game are both going downhill since this has happened. So I'm choosing yes to back pain. I'm choosing yes to golf. So there you go.
The irony is that even though you're allowed to play golf in New South Wales at the moment, nobody can get a tee time anywhere because every course is currently full. So I don't think as many people playing as what we would like anyway.
I can only imagine down here that when they do open the golf courses, it's going to be absolute bedlam trying to get a place anywhere. So maybe another couple of weeks for me.
Now they want to have a very, very sharp booking system to be able to cater for the crowds. And I think I'd be employing security on the front gate of Royal Melbourne, Kingston Heath, everything down to the Mount Macedon Golf Club. If I were Golf Victoria in a couple of weeks' time.
Or maybe in my case, it's going to be Studley Park or Oakley 9. So they're my most frequently attended places. So hopefully they're a little bit more quiet.
Drew, my heart bleeds, mate, so much that I'll send you a photo from the golf course. I don't even like golf that much, but I will go and play just so I can get a game under my belt to make you feel better later in the week, mate. I promise.
Sure, I'll be very happy to see you playing golf at Longreef, then having a surf after. That would probably just kill me, I reckon, to see that.
We'll get going on the introduction then after I've heckled you. Tim Detman's my name. I'm a physio at Kieser Australia, and I'll be your MC for the evening. Our first presenter tonight is Drew McGuinness, and Drew's a physio of 18 years experience and has been with Kieser for over 6 years. He's got a postgraduate master's in sports physiotherapy, and as you can hear from our conversation, a very strong passion for any sporting game or any type of physical activity. He's currently working with Cricket Victoria with the Futures and Pathway teams, and has got previous experience with the Melbourne Stars, and we'll talk in a minute about whether you came across Andrew McDonald. Drew's also affiliated with the Olympic Winter Institute and is a very, very good skier from all reports, although we haven't hit the slopes together. And I'm going to let Drew get going because we've got a really special guest in Andrew McDonald joining us once Drew's finished the background on the lumbar spine. But down the bottom of the screen, some of you have already found the Q&A section. And if at any point do you have a question other, Dan Lee, than whether I've got product in my hair, then they're more than willing to answer it. So start typing those questions as early as you like. And Drew, thank you very much. We're just going to share the results of this poll, and then I'll let you get started. So as we'd expect, 80% of the Australian population has got back pain, and 85% of our attendees tonight have had back pain at some point. We've got 48% runners in the audience, or that most frequently participated sport. And next best is cricket. And we've got a bit of a mix between athletes and clinicians. So that probably gives you a little bit of context about who's joining us this evening. But Drew, I will get out of your hair, turn off my video, and let you go.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for the great introduction. So yeah, it's a privilege to be here to present on the Sporting Lumbar Spine. I love talking about sports physiotherapy. I could probably spend all day talking about it. But alas, I've got about half an hour to try and encapsulate the Sporting Lumbar Spine. So in the next half hour or so, I'm going to cover the sporting injury process, how this is related to the context of the lumbar spine, and in particular, look at a couple of sports that, in particular cricket and golf, that on one hand, historically, might have been viewed to be not such a fitness and performance-based couple of sports, as exemplified by these lovely gentlemen in the picture. But let's face it, the last 20 years, and I'm glad to see, performance research and where we've taken these sports has only gotten a lot better since then. So that said, this follows quite nicely from that poll. Let's talk about the low back pain problem in the general population. So statistically, 80% of Australians will suffer back pain. Up to 20% of Australians have back pain at any one time. 80% of these will have at least one recurrence. 85% will recover from an acute episode in those 3 months, or those first 3 months. But 50% of these cases will develop into persistent chronic low back pain. So it's no surprise that when we consider the sporting population with low back pain, the prevalence is pretty similar. So it ranges between 18 to 65%, which reflects these numbers. And at the top end of 65%, we're looking at sports such as rowers, gymnasts, dancers, and cricketers, which probably comes as no surprise to many. So what can we do in terms of lumbar spine injuries in sport? Well, it's a mixture of things. So first of all, as this skier shows, we've got trauma. So when you fall heavy, you can injure your back very badly. We've also got repetitive positions and postures that rowers are one, but then in this particular picture, a cricketer might have, and batsmen. So whilst we're talking about fast bowlers a lot, batsmen are obviously prone to back injury as well. And this famous gentleman had a lot of problems through his career. Then you've got, then we've got the gymnast or the hypermobile athlete, dancers included. And when you look at the shape of the spine here, it's no surprise that compressing the spine like that could cause problems. And then in this case, the heavy lifting or weight lifter. So when we look at the big weightlifter like this, and we think about heavy lifting, we probably think about high likelihood of getting injury. Quite contrary though, they were on the lower end of the spectrum of those statistics. My guess is that these athletes are particularly strong, particularly adept at building strength in these functional movements, and therefore maybe have an advantage over a lot of people in sport. So there's something in that, I feel. Not to forget that our everyday average hacker will get injuries such as the average golfer, independent of age, and the lawn bowler. So it's not just all about the elite athlete. So what can happen? What can we do to our spines? Across the population, in the sporting population, there are structures that can cause pain if we stress them out too much. You've got things that you might have heard before, like disc bulges, soft tissue issues. We've got joint sprains. We've got sciatica. We've got nerve impingement or pinched nerve. We've got postural issues like scoliosis. We've got good old wear and tear in discs and joints. And in red here, we've got stress fractures highlighted because I'm going to discuss this at a bit more depth. And then when all else fails, worth mentioning too, that maybe we do need surgery to correct some issues, the same as the general population. So what's our process in terms of managing sports injuries? Where do we start? So I like to think of it more broadly as screening contributing factors or risk factors that we may have gained over years of knowledge and research. And you can break this down into probably two key areas. So you've got intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors, and then the things we look at that are potentially modifiable and those that are non-modifiable. So with intrinsic factors, we're referring to the intrinsic makeup of the person, their physicality or their own hardware. So modifiable, or things that we can modify, will pertain to things like the physical, like strength and range of motion and mobility and stability. But we also look at things like technique and how people perform their sporting skills and biomechanics, which we can manipulate to a point. The non-modifiable things will be things like age, will be things like genetics, and be things like gender. So differences or inherent differences between males and females that we need to be aware of. When it comes to the extrinsic, we're referring to things outside the individual's makeup, so things that may influence that. The modifiable ones would be things like equipment, so anything from footwear, especially with runners, to clubs for golfers and how they fit, to just what you wear, and essentially that can have a big say on performance and therefore injury over time. And then we look at load, and load's a big one I'll go through later. Something that we can manipulate in terms of day-to-day, week-to-week, and year-to-year for our athletes. The non-modifiable things we need to think of are environment. So what pitches they play on, or surfaces, and the weather and the country. So things that we can be aware of but can't necessarily change. And then contingency, by which I mean things that we just cannot account for. So really important from a sports injury point of view to know that the only way to minimise risk completely for injury is to not play sport, which is wildly impractical. So the nature of sport is there's going to be impact, there's going to be accidents, there's going to be things we can't account for. And that's what contingency is. So the who in sports. So what, or who are the people that manage in sports injury management these things and injuries? So what's our team? And I thought I'd highlight a bit of a look at the top end or elite at how things might look. So I'm sure we've all watched AFL or soccer or cricket and seen the plethora of people sitting on a bench these days and in coaches' boxes, all wielding their laptops and analytical equipment, overanalyzing the hell out of everything compared to the old days where it was the coach and a massage therapist and a boot starter. So lots has changed. And the makeup of an elite organisation will start at the top with key stakeholders, which number one would be your coaches. But you've also got to be aware of the business and the business side of the sport with CEO, owners, directors, managers, and sponsors. So we're always feeding back into those. Now, there'll be a central point from a sports medicine point of view, a chief medical officer that is sometimes a physio, but more often a sports doc. And then beneath them, you've got a physio or team of physios, a strength and conditioning team, and then anything from psychologists to dietitians to radiologists to consultant sports docs. And beneath them, massage teams and sports trainers and water boys are feeding through, all interacting to form a well-oiled cog in machine to come up with injury management.
So I just want to chime in there for a second because we've had a question from the audience and I want as many questions as possible. The question was, why is environment non-modifiable? And because you might be able to change the place where you're playing cricket or change the ground where you're playing AFL. So just wondering your thoughts on that. That was a question from Victoria.
Yeah. Good point. I think, to a degree. I mean, if you look at cricket, for example, you go to India and they doctor the pitches to make it suit them. And in Australia, we doctor the pitches to suit us. So yes, they are somewhat manipulable, or, you can change them, but by the same token, there's a part to it which we cannot change. So true, good point, good question. We can have a little bit of a say in it. It's not a hard.
The important point there, Drew, is that we can't necessarily control the fixture, and leagues might be able to change the type of grass that we play on, or change the surface, of a turf pitch compared to an AstroTurf pitch. But once we're in the game, it's not immediately changeable. Whereas technique, you could change ball to ball. Shoes, you could change ball to ball. But you can certainly launch an argument that environment is changeable. And then the second question, coming from our very own Adam Lincoln, is in your experience, Drew, are the physios and chief medical officers always in sync, or are their views at times different?
Yeah, that's a big one. There's in my experience, there's often a bit of butting of heads, but I think the good organisations, like anything, a well-oiled machine. So at least in my side of things, I think there's been that team diagram highlighted before. There's been a really good interactive, very well respected approach across the disciplines. But I'm sure at times you're going to get some conflict. I think
the answer there is, Adam, that in any team that Andrew McDonald coaches, then the CMO and the head physio would be speaking very, very closely, and they'd be working together cohesively. But not all coaches are as good as Andrew McDonald, so you might see a little bit of dysfunction in some other teams.
Well said. So with that, moving from the team environment, we're going to look at the rehab side of things and the role of the sports physio. So it's one thing to point out that there's a ready-made team and an elite organisation assisting each other in a well-oiled way. But at community level, where I largely spend my time here at Kieser in Camberwell, it's still very much a team approach. So I've got my team. I've got my favourite sports docs. I've got my coaches. I've got my allied health associates. I've got my even favourite radiology centre and radiologist, just send to people. So I've got my team. But when we look at sports physio and the roles they would play in both situations, well, here's one particularly good sports physio that I know of at the centre here. And some of the roles that he might have played and I would do in my role as a physio in sports, we're going to be looking at things like screenings we touched on before, like intrinsic, extrinsic, modifiable, non-modifiable, physical risk factors, the things that we look at from that point of view. Then we're very well known for our passive relief therapies, by which I mean manual therapy, electrotherapy, needling, all the things we do to try and relieve aches and pains and keep, especially in season, a player feeling finely tuned. We then have a role in load management, so the educational load management and particular self-monitoring. So across a lot of sports that I work in and around Australia in certain bodies, there is an athlete management system, or AMS, which is a database where we get the athletes to hopefully reliably fill in their data day by day of what loads they're doing. And that's provided a lot of insight into things that could be detrimental and things we can implement in time to improve that. And then, of course, finally, we're involved in exercise rehab and progressive return to sport. So let's put this in the context of a sport, in particular cricket, and a case study of cricket, the lumbar stress fracture and fast bowlers in cricket. I will stipulate at this point that whilst I'm focusing on this injury, because it's a fantastic, challenging injury to go through and something I've got experience in, you can almost apply the process I'm going through here to any lumbar spine injury that may appear in sport. Now, the lumbar stress injury is one that may seem very prevalent and has probably arisen in recent times more for some good reasons, but it has been an age-old issue as exemplified by some of the most successful Australian bowlers like Lillee and Tomo, who, whilst having great careers, they did suffer from lumbar stress injuries. To more recent guys that we may know of, like Cummins and Pattinson, who've had their fair share of problems in their early careers. So how do we manage stress fractures, and what are the facts and stats? So one of the most prevalent injuries in cricket, it certainly is, and it has a prevalence from 4% to up to 22% at any one time in a fast bowler, and up to 40% will have a lumbar stress injury across their career. There's a huge subset of this, the adolescents, where they're at 4 times greater risk under the age of 22 of developing a problem. It's most commonly the opposite side to the bowling arm in 80% of the cases. So a right arm will have a left low back issue and vice versa. A big one too is the timeout. So it takes 6 months for a stress fracture to heal, and therefore potentially up to 6 to 12 months to return to sport. It also has high recurrence rates of up to 51%. So why is this? A lot of reasons, but one of the obvious ones in the last 20 years is rapid load escalation in the last 20 years, where we've had far more matches. We've got a new revolution in T20. We've got 50-50s in the long forms of the game. So it's an all year round sport. It's something that's not seasonal like it once used to be.
Drew, I just want to highlight one point that you've got there, because I know Macca will talk about it a little bit later on. And that's the adolescent subset in this injury population. And from, you and I both understand that the spine doesn't finish ossifying until very late in adolescence, perhaps even, early in young adulthood. That's one of the reasons why this injury is so high, in combination with the load that you were talking about, but it has really interesting implications for coaches like Macca. So just wanted to put a flag in that, because we will come back to it when we're asking questions of Andrew soon.
Yeah, good point. And certainly in a later slide, I'll touch on this a little bit more as well. So it is one of my passions, as you pointed out, and it's a big one for me. So you'll hear more about that from me in a sec. So moving ahead to the cause and presentation. Well, you look at the sequence of a fast bowler here. We've all seen fast bowling, I'm sure, at some stage. It's a unique thing. It's asymmetrical. It's got a lot of impact and has a potential for overuse through repetitive micro-trauma. Impact of up to 13 times body weight on that front foot contact, to a point where stresses can ultimately lead to more than the tissue load shielding can cope with. So give insufficient time for the bone in this case to recover, we've got problems. Symptoms that can develop, you'll start getting pain with bowling, more so than batting. And certainly if things get a lot worse, you'll start feeling pain with simple movements of everyday tasks and a rest and sleeping overnight. Important to note also classification. So there's two clear classifications we're looking at with bone stress injuries. The early stages, or bone strain, a reaction of sorts, where we'll see things like bony edema or swelling in the boning level. And if this gets more severe, it can lead to that stress fracture, which is a big, serious step. And MRI or radiology, certainly MRI, is the best way to assess this, as this picture shows to the right, to be able to tell the difference between those two things. So what do they look like? Well, a stress fracture, if you look at the anatomy of the lumbar spine, our lumbar spine, referring to those lower 5 levels of the lumbar spine before we hit the pelvis, the lumbar spine is essentially a bunch of vertebral bodies with a disc at one side that acts as a real support structure, with discs providing shock absorption. And then if we look at this little slide off to the right, where we've got a cross section where the body's there, but we've got almost like this big arch or roof to the joint that connects across the back of the spine. So between these levels, we've got like a strut, and this is called the pars interarticularis, which sort of provides a little strut between each level and each of the joints either side that connect across the back of the spine. So it's at this little level where we might get stress between those joints conveying, and this is the point where we'll see bone stress failure and bone stress fracture. So the management process, and coming back to the things and looking back at the flow charts I was going through. So the intrinsic, the extrinsic, the modifiable, the non-modifiable, and bearing in mind that we're looking at research support, things that I've seen that have credence at Cricket Australia level, state level and pathway levels. So things that we look at with some form of scrutiny. And if we look at age first and gender, well, we know that males seem to have more than females in terms of prevalence. I would suggest this is historically skewed, as darts has been limited as females become newer to the elite side of the game. So this may change over time. As we said before, we've got 4 times the risk of developing problems under the age of 22. And then this one, the big one for me in terms of the pathway or juniors, is a hugely amplified risk in getting problems in peak growth zones. So when we're growing up to 1 centimetre per month, or around that mark, which is the age of 12 to 15 for males and 10 to 13 for females, this is a highly susceptible, vulnerable stage. And for me, the advice should be, which is for me, that this is a period where we should be deloading it a little bit and we should be nurturing growth and development. When in fact...
Yes. Drew, I'm going to ask some questions on behalf of the non-clinicians who are listening tonight. Yep. So if I'm the parent of a 14-year-old child, and that child's, I've noticed their appetite double in the last couple of weeks. What do I do?
Well, I'd suggest well, I'm not sure where you'd go with that and how far you'd assess it, but I think it's probably a good solid sign that they're in growth, especially if they're in these age zones. And I'd be thinking that this person needs to be monitored closely in terms of how much activity they're putting through their body. They need to rest a bit more to be able to allow the body to grow during that essential phase.
So I'm going to ask Macca this question as well in 15 minutes, what he does as a coach and what his teams do to monitor young players. But if you were the parent of a young player, would you go as far to measure their growth? If they're high-level cricket or high-impact sports, and you think they are growing, they're doing a lot of load, would you go as far to measure their growth regularly?
Yeah, knowing what I know, I'd say yes. I definitely look at this. I mean, you tend to get an idea of when your kids are growing. Absolutely, I think it's a great gauge. So using that 1 centimetre per month rule, I think is one that's suggested in the pathway at least of a real risk zone or a flag that you can use, aside from, as you said, massive increase in appetite and sleep, to go along with that and make that decision. Absolutely. And unfortunately, with that said, what I do tend to see, and even to this day, is it goes the opposite way. Reason being, a kid grows, they're bowling well, they start knocking over wickets left, right and centre. They suddenly go from juniors, they start playing for their school, and then all of a sudden their senior clubs want a piece of them, and their risks or their loads go massively up this way. And this is where so many problems can arise and set ourselves off on a really bad pathway long term. So for me, this is why I'm so big on this period of time and getting that right. We move on to the physical factors. So we look at things that are seen to be increasing compressive forces. So we look at mobility of the foot and ankle in particular, and hips. We look at muscle shortening like the hamstring. And we look at spinal things like lumbar lordosis and extension. So your natural curvature of your spine may be over accentuated going backwards. And if you've got stiff extension, then this is only going to serve to increase compression in your lumbar spine. So that seems to be a risk factor as well. And then you've got your issues of poor muscle control. So for instance, with single leg stance, we look at that and see not just through poor movement patterns of control, the muscle contribution there and where there may be weaknesses precipitating that. Then we're looking at bowling technique and biomechanics. So there's two key technique issues that have been talked about a lot over years. The mixed bowling action, which is highlighted in this diagram down the bottom here, where we've got three diagrams, one of a typical front action bowler, one of a side action bowler, and then one of what we call the mixed action, where you've got half of one and half of the other. So one side of the body's rotated counterwise to the other one. And it seems to be that if you have this greater than 30 degrees, you've got some element of increased risk of putting strain on the spine. Then the second one is excessive opposite lateral flexion, or otherwise known as fall away. When we look at a pro here and then we look at an amateur, the fall away or lateral fallout is pretty significant. And naturally we would find this a bit concerning to see that compression in the lower lumbar spine. So part 4, the loads. Good to say, and what we've got out in recent years with Cricket Australia with data and collecting loads, that we've got some pretty good figures of what we know to be risk factors. So guys like the famous old physio Alex Contouris, who's now head of medicine at Cricket Australia, has been instrumental in collecting data and putting into meaningful things that we can apply. So frequency of bowling, greater than 2 times a week bowling spells, especially in juniors, is seen to be a risk. Spikes in bowling numbers greater than 8 over spells or greater than 150 overs in 3 months is seen to be a risk. But also on the flip side, breaks or long periods of deloading, and then returning back to fast bowling and reloading is seen to be equally as a risk. So what we're trying to do here with loads is similar to what we're doing in life and the world at the moment, is flatten the curve, make sure there's no peaks and troughs. The final point is radiology. And whilst on one hand, it's great that technology can help us see so much, we've also noticed in recent times that a lot of what we see is not necessarily equated to pain and problems. So we've been de-threatening some of these things with general back pain to make sure people are not moving and are doing exercises. Well, I've got to say a little bit with MRI in that it's a bit different with lumbar spine injuries. It's crucial in early detection and management. So early on in the problem, when we're getting this bone edema and stress reaction, it's asymptomatic. So the problem's already manifesting. And if we're not flagging or picking this up and this leads to stress fracture, all of a sudden you go from potential 2 weeks rest to 6 months off. So at the high levels, screening MRIs are helping them with their contracted players pick these moments. And whilst MRIs aren't particularly accessible yet to a lot of people at regular intervals, what we're learning now is that we can see the patterns developing, so we just know with load purely when we should be giving 2 weeks off and preventing the risk of going into that stress fracture 6 months off. So now I'm going to transition to another sport, golf, a more common sport perhaps, one that represents a span of age 40 to 80 especially. Our Kieser folk hold a lot of this population. It's also a sport that has up to 28% prevalence of back pain. It's also very similar to fast bowling and cricket insofar that it's repetitive, it's asymmetrical, there's rapid rotational movements and the potential for overload. So on one hand, we've got the elite issue. We've got the goat over here, Tiger, in this top diagram, who had well publicised back issues, but he's the 0.01% of the golfing population who could develop the most amazing swing through a violent action and incredible mobility and strength, but still get himself into back problems. Now, none of us can ever dream to be as good as this guy could be. So the more common golfer's back is probably a little bit more similar to what's going on in a fast bowler. Insofar that if we're stiff and we've got weaknesses and we don't have the most amazing technique, then we're going to be potentially generating joint compression pains and aches. So what's our process with the golfer's back? Well, absolutely not a lot differently to what we do with cricketers. We screen risk factors, we look at things like age and gender differences, we look at the physical, like mobility and stability, in particular, things like the thoracic spine stiffness and muscular control of the hips and core. And then we also look at load. So the average recreational golfer is really into it, might play twice a week on average, but they all of a sudden might go on that golfing holiday and do 4 days back to back or even play the club chance. So we're looking at 4 days back to back and things that may spike. And then finally, we're looking at technique. In this picture across the right, there's a common default here that is called reverse spine. Essentially, this is a fault that can create excessive compression extension. So we're looking at these types of things as well. Just one slide too on the importance of technique. I'm putting this here because I feel I get asked this question so often, and I'm pretty sure this may be something I'm interested to hear from with Andrew after myself, as it is the domain of coaches, and he's the gun coach and the gun player. But for me, I always get asked is how important is technique and what is the actual perfect technique? So once upon a time, till not so long back, I'd be advocating that technique was number one, physical conditioning and load management were behind that. So in essence, if you've got not the perfect technique, then you bang your head against a brick wall just doing your physical conditioning and load management. Well, I've kind of flipped around. I think a lot of people have to being the other way around, where it's more prioritised to be physically conditioned and load managed for two reasons. One, look at this guy Malinga across to the right and this guy Jim Furyk at the bottom. They definitely do not have perfect techniques or things that we'd say we teach. And more so with Malinga, it looks like he's got a lot of things that may cause back issues. But I can safely say he never really did have much back issues throughout his career and he was very successful. Same thing with Jim Furyk. Not the perfect technique, but very successful. So what is perfect technique if not potentially the perfect technique for you? Part two, what can we do with technique? How can we make meaningful changes in technique? Well, there's a thing called 10,000 hours of practice, which happens a lot with our athletes at a young age. And after 10,000 hours of practice, we're pretty hardwired into what we've put together as a technique. And we found this out with some fast bowlers and other sports that when we try to manipulate technique at a later age, it often seems a bit futile and very hard to change. So we then come back to looking at the things we can manipulate a little bit better, like physical conditioning and load management. But as I said, I'd be interested to hear the coaching expert side of this potentially after this. Let's get back to the rehab side of things. So the role of the sports physio and our gun physio here in the middle. We're going to focus on the red zones here, so exercise rehab and progressive return to sport. So with exercise rehab, there's some key principles we need to think about. So we start simple. We look for issues of mobility and stability, and we look at what pain has done to our musculoskeletal system. And then we look at how we can restore balance to the musculoskeletal system or the muscular system. And there's two key components. You've got your stability system, which is your static support muscles for your joints. And then you've got your movement system, which are more your global muscles that provide power and drive through explosive movements. Then we have to be a bit aware of a thing called the strength and conditioning continuum. So one sentence that I think epitomises this approach, and something I've used over the years, is to strengthen the muscle first, then the movement, and then to continue both. And in a more elaborate sense, this green arrow progression highlights the things we're looking for, from mobility to start with and stability and motor control, to strength, then strength endurance, and then to power and power endurance as we bring in those bigger movements and global muscles. It's important to say that when we...
Drew, I think it's worthwhile closing the loop on a comment that you made in your last slide, because it applies so well to that phrase there, that strengthen the muscle and then the movement is the way that we approach things these days. And so then, and particularly for young athletes and developing athletes, we can make changes over time in their technique, but usually because we give them more movement in a certain body part, or we give them more strength or more stability in a certain body part. If in the absence of strength, we try and tell someone to change their technique, then often they can't, no matter how hard they try. But if we can address something as a physio team and as the strength and conditioning team, then maybe we can make a change, a minor change in technique over time. And that's how we get the progression of people's efficiency.
Absolutely spot on. So echo those thoughts entirely. So we help, in that case, the coach then achieve that better technique for their athlete. So the final piece to the puzzle is function, skills, a graded criteria return to sport. That's our final piece. Now, to think of a starting point, the effect of injury and pain, and then restoring the balance of the muscular system. So this simple flowchart highlights what we do. So if you think about a pain event, a back injury in particular in this case, what happens under these pain events is we'll get an immediate switch off from your stability muscles, but we'll get this adaptive posture. So your big global muscles will fire up in guard, leaving you with these altered patterns of movement. Now, when pain subsides through relief or just time alone, these muscular changes don't just magically go back to where they were. You're going to have leftover tightnesses, and you're certainly going to have these weak muscles needing to be strengthened. And if we don't do anything about that there, then our susceptibility to injury only becomes worse, and we just get this vicious cycle of deconditioning. So, when it comes to lumbar stability muscles, we've all heard of a term called the core. What is the core? We look at this diagram off to the left. We can think of the core as a bit of a barrel around our lower torso. So from the front side, we've got our abdominal muscles. At the bottom, we've got the pelvic floor. At the top, we've got our respiratory diaphragm. And at the back, we've got important back muscles, in particular the multifidus, which I'm going to elaborate on in a second. And then if we look at this other diagram across the right, if we extend the core out a bit front to back, we work in slings. So the idea of slings or diagonals across the front and back. On the back side, some of these back muscles integrate with your butt muscles, your gluteals. And on the front side, the abdominal muscles will integrate with your leg muscles like your adductors and thighs. And these powerful slings that we can generate buttress the front of the spine and the back of the spine. And these are the things that we're trying to strengthen. So coming back to this multifidus, really important muscle, as I said. This diagram shows that it's a muscle that has these little bits that connect from one level of the spine to the other. And whilst it's a small muscle, it's an incredibly powerful muscle. And in fact, it's the most important stability muscle of the spine, providing up to 60% of stability to those joints of the spine. And what we know from MRIs, it's highlighted in these slides here, is that we can see when atrophy and wasting is occurring. So going from left to right here, we've gone from good muscles to white, and a lot more white as we're looking at people with pain and problems and injury. So the switch off a muscle is leading to atrophy, and it's leading to deconditioning, it's leading to fat creeping in. That's what the white is fat. So we can actually see this now. We can actually know that, like anywhere else in the body, deconditioning leads to loss of muscle, and therefore that we can strengthen this and get this back to the left side of the screen.
Drew, we've got about 5 minutes before you and I cut over to Macca, and I ask him which one of those MRIs he thinks is his. But my question here is are they age-related changes or are they pain-related changes? Like, don't I just lose muscle as I get older?
A bit of both, I'm sure, but I think in those slides and in the case that I'm driving at here, this is pain-related changes. So the solution, targeted strength training. We need to target muscles. Here at Kieser, we use a machine called the lumbar extension, and it's a machine I absolutely love. Why? Because it allows safe, natural flexion extension of the lumbar spine. It targets that multifidus, and it is 50% more powerful than any other exercise in getting this important muscle multifidus stronger. It's far superior to any exercise I've come across to start this process of strengthening the most important muscle in the spine to rehabilitate. We also got to think about other target exercises. We've got to think about machines that we use here as well that isolate mobility of thoracic spine and abdominal muscles with the thoracic spine, and also machines that target things like the glutes that are important to stabilise as well on the side here. But then we've got to look to stability and function. So we're nothing unless we put this stability into some form of functional context. And I'm going to show you a quick video of a guy who's an Olympic skier. So this guy, Andrew McDonald, is a Swiss mogul skier. As you know, I love skiing. And he's demonstrating, I would argue, every element you could possibly wish for in terms of strength, balance, control, power, function. Now, I wouldn't recommend anyone potentially does this at home. I certainly wouldn't. But in his case, it's probably the reason why he's pretty good at flipping off jumps and landing on bumps at high speeds. Suffice to say, we may not need this in cricket and golf, but we certainly need to improve our function in a similar way. So, pausing there. If we put this in the context of, say, cricket and the things I do, functional exercises, well, look at things like squats. So things that will start building strength in the legs and glutes in the back, putting into more progressive positions like this cricketer here. If we look at this more challenging position for a similar exercise before, I love this because I use this for all my fast bowlers. It looks exactly like the follow through, so it makes sense. And then we're looking at functional exercises that bring in other planes of movement like rotation. In one position, in a more challenging position, and like Dustin Johnson's doing here as a party trick, standing on one leg and using rotation with the ball. And then the final piece of the puzzle, as I said before, is a graded return to sport. So what we do is we look at progressive skills progressions and also exercise in a criteria-driven way. So what I mean by that is looking at little milestones that make sense for safe progression of the body over time. Being very aware of the fact that healing is part of that process. And we think about lumbar stress injuries taking up to 6 months to heal and the load management implications of that, then we make it a very careful, measured process. It's collaborative and decision-making process of the team. There's often a lot of pressures. So thinking about the stakeholders at the top, we're often under non-ideal pressures to get people back into certain timeframes. So it's never as easy as it seems. But if you look at fast bowlers, we can surmise that some of the things I do for return to skills would be starting walking, shadow bowling, then starting to bowl faster and for a longer run up, building intensities, building over rates. Then we look to a golfer, often forgotten that we could do, many things out of playing 9 holes or 18 holes of golf. We can actually just stand there and chip and putt and get our body used to that movement and that position. And at the same time, improve a really important part of our game, the short game. So finally, the take-home points of my part of the presentation. So seeing the people that have chimed in and the sports that they're interested in, and surmising too that there may be a mixture of elite athletes, parents, older, younger, recreational, coaches, that there's a few take-home points I want you to get from this little presentation of mine. First of all, that lumbar spine or low back pain is a challenging problem, and it's highly prevalent, as is exemplified with the lumbar spine injury. You should look for your team to help you with this, preferably a sports physio like myself, and definitely his or her friends. So the team that I have, my sports docs, etc., someone's going to help you as their team. From elite to non-elite, from young to old, from male to female, the process is the same. We're assessing, addressing contributing factors. We're looking at exercise rehab, starting with targeted strength training to functional to return to sport. Then finally, but most importantly, whilst low back pain is a challenging issue, we can manage it. Exercise and strength training is the #1 evidence-based intervention, and I feel the Sporting Lumbar Spine only highlights this. That's all from me. These are my contact details. I'm happy to take any questions via this email, so you can take a photo of that or screenshot it, and my phone number, as well as directing you to our webinar's web link.
Drew, thank you very much for that presentation. Your passion for cricket is obvious, and your passion for the lumbar spine is obvious. So we're going to keep you around. There's a few more questions that we've had asked from the audience that I still want to ask you towards the end of this. And for anyone who does want to make contact with Drew, we'll be sure to share all of these contact details in the email that we send around in the next couple of days. But I think it is an appropriate time now for us to welcome Andrew McDonald. So Drew, if you just want to stop sharing your screen, and then Andrew, if you're still there, just turn on your microphone, and I've got a few questions that I wouldn't mind asking. And feel free to turn on your video too, Andrew, depending how appropriately addressed at 7:48.
I can do that. I've just got a little bit of a growth factor happening at the moment in isolation, but thanks for having us, guys. Great
Andrew,
to be on board.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time. Now, I've got a long list of your credentials in front of me at the moment, but I feel like your #1 credential is homeschooling 2 children. How's that going?
It's brutal, to be perfectly honest. So it's put a different light on when I drop the kids off at school now and I see the teachers. They do a magnificent job, and hopefully schools open up very, very soon and we can all get back to life in normality. But yeah, just hopefully everyone else out there is safe at the moment, and wish everyone well during this period.
Yeah, I've got a lot of respect for how everybody's handling this from right across society, but certainly those parents who are working just as you are, and trying to homeschool children. I think you're doing a very impressive job, mate. So a little bit of Andrew's CV for those who don't know him. Certainly his most high profile job at the moment is the senior assistant coach of the Australian cricket team, the most closely watched cricket team in the entire country. But what many of you might not know is that Andrew's been a friend of ours at Kieser for nearly 10 years, I reckon, Macca.
I think well over 10 years, yeah.
First introduced by Paul Percy, and we've seen you in your time at the Bushrangers and your time with a couple of test matches for Australia, then going on to coach the Victorian team. Now, obviously, you've got that senior assistant role at the Australian team, coaching the Rajasthan Royals, the IPL, and I've got a question about when the IPL's going to start, and then the head coach of the Birmingham Phoenix 100 ball team. So you certainly are keeping your time busy, aren't you?
Yeah, no, it's since retirement, or as I said to Paul Percy the other day, since I got sacked, it's been a pretty quick transition into coaching. I went to Leicester this year, and then find myself with a few caps on that people remind me of. But working with some fantastic athletes, and just listening to Drew there, sort of, it's a shame that sport's not happening at the moment. But it'll have to wait. But as you said, there's new competition in England as well, the Birmingham Phoenix, which is a 100 ball competition, which is a totally new format of cricket as well. So it makes 4 formats within the one sport, which is very interesting.
Yeah, Macca, I've got a heap of questions, and for everyone listening, we might run this a little bit over 8 o'clock, so I can ask you a few. But can you start with how you got introduced to Kieser, or how you came to find yourself on that piece of equipment that Drew showed just before?
brought back some memories, that piece of equipment. Not that enjoyable most of the times in those positions. But yeah, my story is a little bit similar to most others involved in sport. And I think the last point that Drew harped on, or second last point, was that, you know, it's for everyone, isn't it? It doesn't matter whether you're an elite sportsman all the way through the grades to amateurs, kids coming through. We all come across, you know, similar problems. And mine was no different. I started my career as predominantly a batsman, and then there was some load increases within my bowling as I got thrown the ball more and more within games. And essentially, to cut a long story short, I was diagnosed with a hotspot, which I think now is classified as an edema, which is the one below, you know, the total stress fracture, and recovered from that, and still had this lingering back pain, which, you know, was sort of going undiagnosed, and I was starting to get a little bit frustrated. It was having an effect on my performance. You know, going through the scans, it wasn't a hot spot, it wasn't a stress fracture. There was some sort of disky stuff happening, which is not uncommon for a fast bowler, but I just couldn't maintain, you know, any strength through range. I was doing a lot of stuff in terms of the Pilates space, yoga space, pretty much doing everything. And it got to a point where I sort of didn't have too many answers. And Rob Castle was a fellow fast bowler within the squad, and he happened to be seeing Paul Percy and Jeff Mackey out of Middle Park physiotherapy. And Robbie had some great results in a short-term sort of space. And, you know, he said, come along. And little did I didn't know Paul Percy was actually working there. I actually played underage cricket with Paul Percy back in Albury, but that's another story for another time. He's probably told everyone how good a cricketer he was anyway, and how stiff and unlucky he was. But basically went there. They were sort of embarking upon this new machine that was sort of coming up from overseas. And there was a place at Sydenham where we had to travel back and forth from. It was a fair way out. And those that were sort of at the start of the whole Kieser journey would probably remember the venue all the way out there, and traffic is always bad. But, you know, Perth said, let's have a crack at this and let's see if we can, you know, get you moving forward in the right direction. So basically what happened, we travelled out there and, you know, got on the machine and diagnosed that I had some issues with strength through range, and in particular multifidus. And a lot of the other stuff I'd been doing was core exercises, Pilates. It was all to do with the front, the transverse abdominis, which is something that was fashionable back then, but no one really spoke about the multifidus. And Drew highlighted there that it's probably the most important part of the whole chain. So we were missing that. And I think that was just through potentially not enough research or not enough recognition for what that muscle did at that time. And that's the beauty about sport. It moves forward day by day, but basically got some strength through the range. I think I was 2 standard deviations, and people that have been to Kieser, 2 standard deviations below the general population with my back strength, which, you know, trying to be a fast bowler or an all-rounder, I wouldn't say fast bowler, medium pace bowler, and all-round duties. My back wasn't prepared to you know, go through that loading in extension when landing, and basically I could get a certain amount of load in before I'd fail, and that's what was happening. And I think that the whole thing about it was that the diagnosis is the critical point. So getting that right, having trust in the people that you're working with. That wasn't to say that I didn't trust the people I was working with inside cricket, but it just wasn't fashionable, the multifidus at that stage. So I think the whole input of Pilates, yoga, plus the Kieser gave me the right balance and gave me the right core stability to be able to do what I was trying to do all along. So that's sort of, you know, trying to sum it up in a short space of time. But I had some strength deficiencies through range, which was contributing to potentially some disc impingements, which was setting me up to fail. So I didn't have a body set up to succeed at that point in time.
Mackie, I completely agree with what you said just at the end there about the fact that the combination of what you were doing, you know, it's not like lumbar extension was the silver bullet that just fixed everything. It was a combination of things. But in your first sentence, you alluded to how uncomfortable it was on that chair sometimes. Yeah. I think sometimes that's part of the piece that's missing is we worked your back really, really hard when you were training on that piece of equipment at specific times. So do you want to just tell people about how difficult it was and how hard you were working?
Yeah, you worked really, really hard. And as I said, it was a range that I had no strength in. So the pain was probably accentuated by the fact that I was really weak through that area. But the one thing I was sort of shocked by at that point in time was the attitude of, even though my back was sore, we were still going to work it hard. And that was probably a significant change. There was an element of, you know, when you did have that sore back, we need a rest, we need to assess, we need to take you through some lighter duties. But you guys are quite aggressive in your approach, and it sort of shocked me a little bit, to be fair. And to be strapped into that machine that's specifically designed for the multifidus, I couldn't get that anywhere else. In any part of my training in my gym, it was near on impossible to isolate that part of the back, which, as we've seen by the research, is one of the most important parts. So for me, I was thankful at that point in time that I come across that. But to be, hunched over and, almost your chest on your quads, and then you got to go back up, and then you got someone counting to 4, and then hold for 2, and then counting to 4, and you just want to throw the odd arm out. But yeah, it was, and you end up getting up to sort of 2 minutes through range. And but the thing was, I had to be patient as well. But to watch the chart and to see my progression, but also to see that the progression from what I was doing on the machine to the amount of overs that I was able to bowl, to getting back pain free, it just all sort of come together. And as you said, it's a combination of things. That was my last piece of the jigsaw puzzle that I needed. But yeah, it was great just to track it, and suddenly you're one standard deviation above the general population, you're 1.5, and you just keep pushing yourself. And all the other machines out there also are equally important. After you do that initial part on the machine, go through your strength through your multifidus, the other elements of the body are just equally as important as well.
Mackie, you touched there on how apprehensive you were when you first used the machine. So I certainly don't mean to turn this into a recommendation for Kieser. So generally, how apprehensive were you about batting, bowling, strengthening exercises, going for a run when you had back pain? And then how did your confidence build? I think it's a really relevant question, given 85% of people who've tuned in tonight have got some form of back pain.
Yeah, I think when you fail on something and your body lets you down, and it continually does, then there's always apprehension in the back of your mind as to what you can and can't do. And even when I had some significant injuries later on in my career, which weren't associated to my back, but it was literally, you wake up and you're waiting for things to go wrong. And that was sort of how apprehensive I was. I was like, geez, this is aggressive. I was saying, I'm definitely going to break in these positions that I'm getting into, and pushing back against it, holding, and Perce was like, you got to trust us here, and that was it. Like you do put your trust into it. He said you're going to have to be patient, but you build that relationship around it. And if you're going forward and you've got the right diagnosis, the trust becomes quite easy, because you do get that spike early on in your recovery where it's like, okay, I've trusted these guys. 4 weeks later, geez, I'm feeling good here. So if the diagnosis is right, the areas that you're strengthening are right, and all the other bits that are going into it, you can see it going forward. So the trust does build quite quickly. But at the start, I must admit, I did think Perce was a little bit of a cowboy, but that's just between us on this seminar.
I've just got a text message from Perce to say he's the best wicket keeper never to play for his country. So no problems with Perce's ego at the moment. Macca, trust would have been a big thing for you as a player with your medical team. But now that you're a coach and you've spent quite a few years coaching, you would be dealing with a lot of young players, young bowlers who are going through exactly what you just described: injury, lack of trust, uncertainty, where do I go? So how have things changed from when you were playing to now when you're coaching?
I think a lot more research has gone into it, and Drew sort of highlighted there, Alex Contouris has probably led that within the country. You guys are doing your own bit of research there, and you're getting some great results as well. So it's changed a lot with the amount of information that we do have. The biggest thing within all that still is that each person is their own individual. So what worked for me won't necessarily work for the person next to me. So you've got to have great trust that the physio doesn't have that cookie cutter approach, or the chief medical officer, or the people that are involved in it. They see you as an individual and a holistic individual, and you have different areas that you need to work on. So that's probably the biggest change for me, is the amount of information that we do have to make really well-educated decisions now. Drew touched on load. Load's become a huge thing. When I was growing up, load was totally irrelevant. It was get on, do as much as you can. And just getting onto the younger athletes, that's something that I suppose is a big area, because that's your high risk area. And they're doing so much at that age. I mean, we had some rookies coming into the Cricket Victoria environment, sort of 16, 17-year-olds getting their first contracts. And there's so many people pulling on them to play school cricket, or to play school footy, or to play basketball, to train, and then suddenly got this whole combination of load, not just necessarily through the lower lumbar either. You're talking about joints and they're growing, and you've got to take that into account. And, different people grow up, different times of their life as well. So you really got to monitor. Measuring is something that we always did. We're fortunate enough to be able to scan most of our players on MRIs to have regular updates on how they're tolerating the load, because a young Mitch Perry is different to a young Zach Evans, and I'm just throwing a couple of young fast bowlers' names in there. So it's really important to treat them as individuals and gather as much information on that individual based around what you've got from the general population as well, which will guide you.
So Macca, every day I chat to my patients about how much load they're putting into their bodies. And for me, that might mean checking their Garmin or checking their iPhone to see, well, how many steps have they done if I'm treating someone with a knee injury or a hip injury. But what tools do you guys use to measure load, and just how closely do you measure it? We're talking days worked, hours out there, or number of balls bowled, like just how specific?
Yeah, we go into balls bowled, depending on the exercise, really. So I think it's perceived effort. So you have this, we've got the AMS, basically an athlete management system where all the stimulus will be plugged into. The players will rate their sessions. They'll count their balls that they've bowled. Generally speaking, that load will be given pre the session by the coach. So we've got some sort of control on what we're putting into them. The S&C will know roughly what load they're putting into the players. So, but it's always important to get their feedback. In particular around the recovery phase. I think the important part is that if you haven't recovered day to day, then it's hard to push on the next day with what you're planning. And that probably becomes a little bit of an issue as you get older. The way that you recover is ultimately important. So we're talking about a preparation phase where we focus on a lot, but critically important is the other end of it all. Once you have done the exercise, once you've put in the hard yards, is to then recover nutrition. So that's all part of the holistic approach on the areas that are important. So, but definitely we monitor them probably too much these days, I'd say. But the information, if it's used properly, I think can help. And that's what we say to the players. The players are probably sick and tired of punching in all the information and all the data and all that sort of stuff. But it actually helps us as head coaches manage right through, to line coaches, physios, to S&Cs. Actually helps us at the other end. So that's valuable information for us to be able to move forward with an athlete.
You said we might be approaching the line of how much we monitor them. What's your concern? Yeah.
I just think that we've probably gathered enough data to know what's happening within games, and there's nothing new flagging up now. I think from a GPS point of view, which is where I'm probably heading with that, with the high speed running and stuff like, we know what we're probably doing, and we're continuing to gather that data. I just think that if you're going to gather things, then it's probably got to be taking you forward. So that's probably the only thing I would say, that there's no reliance on probably those areas.
Mate, I want to start to cross to a few questions that we're getting from people listening. So tell us about any upcoming fast bowlers that we should be keeping our eye on in the Australian cricket team over the next couple of years.
I think Cameron Green's an exciting young all-rounder. So he's one. I'm going to go to the Victorian bias of Mitch Perry, beautiful swing bowler. So he's coming through the pathway, an old-fashioned sort of curler of the cricket ball. So if there's anyone out there, sort of 50 plus that, swing bowling's dead, he might be able to revive it. Who was there? Jai Richardson, who's just burst onto the scene, probably in the last 12 months. He suffered a shoulder injury, of late. So he's on the rehab path. They're probably three that, I'd look out for.
And with those guys who are coming up, Drew talked about technique, strength and conditioning, and load. Tell us a little bit about what you guys do around their technique, if they've shown talent at an early age.
Yeah, it depends on where you get them. I mean, it depends on the pathway, which is generally speaking 15 to 19 years of age, and then you get them early on in the state squad versus the well-established players. Biomechanics is hard to change. So unless, and Drew touched on it before, and it's one of the big things is, for me, the definition of technique is something that's repeatable to that individual. So who are we to say that we're the custodians of what the perfect technique is, for starters? We do have some guidelines which we work in, which Drew touched on in terms of the counter rotation, mixed actions, which may put you at an increased rate of injury. However, if the athlete's performing and doing well and playing at the highest level, playing international cricket, it's always hard then to intervene and say, well, hang on, your action might get you injured, and change that based upon a player who's performing really, really well. And that's generally what you have within, elite cricket, is they come onto the contract list because they're performing at a certain level. So, do you intervene to take away the risk of injury, or do you let them crack on and be the best cricketer and then deal with the injury after it happens? And there's some sort of stuff that we've stumbled across, and there's no scientific base, but every time that we do change a player's action that have stress fractures, we tend to stress them in a new area. So that change then stresses them as well. And there's a school of thought, and it hasn't been proven, but if you keep the action the same, that stress point potentially is stronger than the rest of the area. So, do you change it? Do you keep it the same? And is stress fractures a load issue as opposed to an action issue? So, there's always a line there. Everyone debates it. The key thing is, though, we've changed our mentality on how much we bowl them. We try to avoid back-to-back days to give them a full day's rest. That's something that's come in. There was a line of thought a few years ago that you had to bowl them back-to-back days to get them ready to do that within a game. Our sort of philosophy in Victoria was to give them a full day off, but in a game they may have to do it. But then that's an outlier there that's potentially increasing the risk of injury. But why would we do that at training then? So we did that a few years back. And the other thing we did do was, I think a person spoke about the environment earlier on, and we've got a brutal environment, which is within indoor centres in Victoria. When we have to train in the winter to get the players ready for the season, we feel as though that's firmer. Firmer, potentially increasing the risk of injury. So therefore, we've shrunk the amount of time that we bowl them in the winter in the indoor centre. And we've had some good results on the back of that. And that was just a gut feel thing. There was the GPS gyrometers that were being used, showed that there was a little bit more force going through their bodies in the indoor centre. So it backed it up. But we don't know whether that's a definitive thing.
Yeah, Mac, I think it's a really interesting point, and a potentially long discussion about if you change someone's technique. If you make too big of a change, you actually increase their risk of injury because they're doing something that's not natural to their body. And do we need to load manage? And from a physio's perspective, I think the control over load management has so much better evidence as a gross generalization across the board that, that's what we focus on in our private practice. And I'm sure your medical teams are exactly the same, just monitoring that load really closely, making small tweaks to technique rather than big ones.
Yeah, and you talked about strength through range before as well, and that was probably the big difference for me as well. Just having the strength to be able to tolerate the action I was bowling with is a key thing. So building that body to bowl at that younger age, I think is absolutely critical. And the load factor is always a hard one, because you do have parts of every sport, whether it be cricket or golf or whatever. More is better. Grinding away, you've got to be repeatable. You've got to do more and more and more, but you increase that risk of injury. And with a stress fracture, it takes away so much skill acquisition within that 12 months if they break down. So we had a couple of instances where some players flagged up on some scans with some edemas, and we were able to manage that through load. So we were able to get them through a season, just taking away their midweek bowls, which was normal, and just bowling them weekend to weekend. And we were able to still get some skill acquisition, some match time into them, and ability to manage that injury as well. So if you do get an edema, it doesn't definitely mean it stops you at that point in time. You're able to manage it to still be able to continue on if you control the load.
Macca, that's a great segue into, it's actually covered off Teresa's question. She asked about whether when something turns up on MRI, whether we completely unload people and take their load off them 100%, or whether we just manage their load back. And what you're saying there is that we just take control of their load and dial it back, rather than, we're not sending them home to lie in bed anymore, are we?
No, we're continue, depending on the severity of it. I mean, I'm talking, gross generalisation here, but depending on the severity of it, and depending on the information from your chief medical officer in our instance, and also your physio, what can and can't they do is the first question I ask as a coach. And then it's about assessing the risk. If it's late in the season, there's no doubt you might want to shut a bowl down, but it's early in the season. You look to other avenues to be able to get them to play some sort of cricket. But definitely, I think the scans don't rule you out. And I think that's the big misnomer. The scans are just there to give us a better understanding of what's happening, and the opportunity to manage it the best we can. So some players, have been hesitant to get scans over over the course of time because they feel as though, oh, well, that's just, a way that I'm going to get ruled out. No, it's just information for us to be able to better manage. That's the way we saw it at Victoria anyway.
And what about, because you're coaching here in Australia, over in the UK and in the IPL. So what about differences in medical staff, coaching approaches between those three countries?
I think it's pretty similar now. I think probably in Australia we've learned a lot off the rest of the world as well. I think we've cross-pollinated ideas, in particular cricket. Going way back to 2008 when the IPL first come on the scene, it was all these nations that didn't talk to each other a lot about what they were doing or share information. So we've had since 2008 a lot of cross-pollination. We've seen different coaches, Australian coaches coaching England and India and vice versa. So I think they're starting to look the same because I think we're finding out the most efficient way to operate. And therefore, within that, most people are up to date. There's not too many outliers within that. I think the biggest thing between, the medical staff and the coaching staff is just trust. And it gets back to that. I mean, I've had some great physios over time. And the one thing I always do, just trust them, ask them a question, they'll give you an honest answer, and you deal with that information from there. So it's no good me as a coach thinking that, I know more than the physio who's the expert in that area. So it's really taking that information on, assessing the risk. And we always talk about the risk. What is the risk here? What are we dealing with? Are we putting them at an increased risk of injury? Can they get through the game? What does it look like even if they do get through the game to the next game? So you're always trying to manage your way through a season. And that's the big thing. I mean, if you've got a slight niggle going to the grand final, you might deal with that differently to a round 1 or 2 game. So it's always about risk and working with the player around that as well. I mean, the player is the most important part in the whole conversation. It's all well and good for the coach and the physio to be talking in the background, but it's really is a triangle when you at the end of the day, it's coach, player, and physio all working on the same project together to get a result.
I certainly agree with that and echo that, and it's definitely a philosophy that we've taken on board at Kieser. I mean, forget our equipment for just a second, but I can guarantee that if a cricketer walks into Drew's office, Drew within 48 hours will have spoken to that player's doctor. He's probably spoken to the coach. He will have spoken to any strength and conditioning or clinical staff. So even in a private practice setting, getting that team approach and just sharing little bits of information makes all the difference in a quick return.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And really, I mean, if you look at the setup, if a cricketer was to go outside the environment like I did to Kieser, it's important that then I take that information back in, or in the case of me, Paul Percy was sort of case managing me at Kieser. So it's a point that then he may need to talk to the people on the inside as well to get the best result, because it's no good having me go outside and then there's no contact with what I'm doing from the outside back onto the inside, which is the most important part, of an elite sports person. And even at amateur level, taking that information back to the coach and making sure that the coach isn't contradicting potentially what has been a positive process for the player.
Well, Macca, I'm up in Sydney with plenty of time on my hands. So if any of the test team boys need a bit of a chop out in the next couple of weeks, just give me a call, mate. Hey, I do want to ask, what are the guys up to at the moment? So the test team first, but also the guys who might be playing IPL.
Yeah, at the moment, it's really, they're like everyone else. I think there's, depending on which state you're in, depends on how much access you have. But essentially what most of them did straight away was the biggest part for any player is, physical preparation, in particular strength. And that was probably the hardest thing to manage. The whole society went out there and, clamoured for the weights and the free weights and put them in their home gym, and suddenly, the products weren't that available. So they all sort of put together home gyms. Some of them already had them in place anyway. So that was a positive, and they continue to work on their physical, preparation. The biggest problem for us is we don't know when the season's going to start. So we really are in a holding pattern, but we've still got to train like, things could change pretty quickly. The NRL players are going through that. The AFL players are going through that at the moment also. But the biggest thing from a coaching point of view is just checking in with the players, making sure they've got everything that they need, staying connected as well. And just checking in on the mental well-being as well as their physical well-being, and making sure that, everything's going well for them. And, it's a great challenge for everyone. We haven't been, presented these sort of circumstances in our lifetime, and life's changed, hasn't it? We got used to a certain way of life. So it's just changed, and just making sure that that we are adapting with that change. And the boys are all getting ready. IPL is a little bit different. A few of the lads in India that are based there, so from my team, they're in complete isolation as well. So they're doing a lot of body weight exercises. They're still ticking over. So as S&Cs and physios and coaches, we've had to get creative with the way that we train them as well. And we've been doing some tactical stuff, some online vision stuff, some meditation, all sorts of things just to change it up, change the stimulus for them, and just give them some sort of routine, which is the way that we've built elite athletes over time, is to give them routine. It's been stripped away. So I think the positive on the other side of this is that they won't be as hell-bent on the routine factor, which may be a small positive going forward.
Really worth touching on those couple of things that you mentioned there, which is routine, physical health, and mental health, because we've had a similar discussion as this, talking about looking after your own physical health for everybody who's a Kieser member, and they're the same pillars that we talked about. So whether you're an elite athlete or whether you're just coming to Kieser a couple of times a week and walking with your friends is just your go-to. Right at the moment, trying to get yourself into some semblance of a routine, looking after your physical health and finding the time to look after your mental health as well, and prioritising it. So great to hear those sentiments echoed.
Yeah, and it's a key pillar. And we sort of sat back and in particular in the IPL space and said, what can we do at this point in time? There's no good, there's opportunity within everything, isn't there? But there's no good harping on what we haven't got. So the first question we ask, okay, what can we do? What does it look like? We need to get creative. And as I said, I think it'll change potentially the way that we do business. It'll potentially change the way that we coach. There'll be certain positives that come out of it. So the opportunity was there. What does it look like? It's different to what we're used to. Let's not get caught up in that as coaches. Let's focus on what we can impact. And as you said, the physical preparation has to happen. But also that the mental well-being is critical. The physical helps the mental, the routine helps the mental. So they all sort of intertwine in the bigger picture of things, and then giving them some sort of project and stimulus around cricket, which is the tactical stuff, some vision, some feel-good stuff about themselves. So yeah, we've been trying to get creative, but we're starting to get, I think we're about 6 weeks in, so the creativity is starting to disappear. So we need to continually work on that. And the one thing that we said to ourselves as a coaching unit was that we can't really stuff this up because no one's ever done it before. So there's no rules as to say, generally speaking, when you've got a job, it's literally, you need to do this because this is what's been before you. Well, it hasn't happened here. So it gave our coaches a bit more of a creative license, with that, okay, we can't stuff it up. What does it look like? Let's go. And the number one thing we said, let's just keep checking with our players and making sure that we flag anything that's unusual.
I think that's a great sentiment, and hopefully anybody who looks after a team in any world, whether it be sport or business or at home with family, hopefully everyone's checking in just like you are. You said that you think things might change out of this. You want to give me a bold prediction of how the world's going to change on the other side, and I'll hold it to you in a couple of months' time?
No, I don't want to make any bold predictions. I just think there'll be change. That's just going out on a limb, isn't it? Hugely. I don't know what it looks like. We'll come up with it. We'll see what happens.
Mate, one more question from Josh in the audience, and then we might wind things up. Thank you so much for your time. But Josh's question was around periodization plan for fast bowlers and managing skills versus strength and conditioning. So wondering how you do that, and also wondering specifically what you've got the guys doing now. Are you winding them up? Are you winding them down? Are you just holding them level?
Yeah, so at the moment, a holding pattern, really. So there's not many. There was a couple of our Indian boys that were bowling because they had access to facilities, and within their state, they were allowed to do certain things. But generally speaking, now it's a holding pattern until we get that start date. And we feel as though the organisers will give us enough time to prep, in particular around T20, because it doesn't have to be significant load. We feel as though that we can get them skill ready within a 5-week period. We feel as though we can get their high-speed running out of the danger zone to make sure that they're not at an increased risk of injury going into round 1 of the IPL. So we feel as though that's about 5 weeks as well. So yeah, just a holding pattern at the moment. But in terms of periodising a bowling plan going into a season, we've challenged ourselves on shortening that. the risk of shortening that, so we've gone from 12 weeks to 8 weeks, and I'm speaking on a Victorian term. I no longer work there, and there'll be a new head coach that may have a different line of thinking. But myself and Mick Lewis, we wanted to shrink it down because of that indoor environment. So the danger with that is that you're not getting enough skill act work into them, and they may not be. But our belief with that was that if they don't break down in the preseason and they're playing games within the season, that is the greatest arena to improve your skills. So it was literally getting them to games, and we feel as though that's the steepest learning curve that can happen within a player rather than preseason training. So the risk was that they potentially might have gone in from a skill point of view underdone into round one, but we felt as though if they were fit and firing, healthy, strong, then they'd be able to increase their skill during the season. And the older players are a totally different conversation. You really just got to get their loads to a point where they're at a decreased risk of injury because they're not really working on anything from a biomechanical view. So, and that looked like, so from a periodization point of view, that looked like 2-3 week blocks with a week off. So 3 weeks, week off, 3 weeks, week off, and then a 2-week block, which included some practice games to get them ready. Some of the guys that were going straight into test cricket, which we had at Victoria, they would have a slightly longer prep in, which would just take into account 2 weeks where they wanted to just do some small biomechanical reinforcement stuff. So there was 2 weeks added on to the front end of it. So everyone's individual as well. So, and that's the other thing too. But around speaking about our younger fast bowling group, that was what we put into place. And we, as I said, we had some good results. You'd have to run that continually year on, year out to see whether that was a good plan, as opposed to we might have just got lucky because the players we had there at that point in time. And that's a realistic outcome as well.
Macca, thank you so much for contributing your time tonight, mate. We really appreciate it. Thank you for your answers to the questions. I'll certainly be taking home that message and spreading the message of trust working within a team. I think that's a really, really important one. And also just that one liner you gave of, we can't get this wrong because no one's done it before. So if we're checking in with our guys, our teams, and we're seeing how they're going, then we feel pretty confident. So I think that's two really good messages for everybody to take home. Thank you very much for everything you had to say tonight.
No, thanks, Tim, and thanks, Drew, for the insights.
And Macca, we look forward to seeing you down at Kieser Geelong, keeping that back strong in the next couple of months. And also, mate, best of luck in the IPL. Best of luck with the test team. I think, the Australian test team is something that we just look up to so much. And we really, I speak on behalf of everyone when I say we can't wait to see those guys playing in some form, in some capacity over summer. And it'll be watched even more closely than ever because in the absence of sport over the last couple of months, we just love it and love it more than ever. So thank you, Drew. Thanks again for your time. For everyone who's still listening, we'll send out a recording of this and we'll send you out a response to all those questions that we missed. But thank you, everyone, for coming in tonight, and hope you